Maureen from Happy So Lucky. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about fabric choices for paper piecing. Often people will ask me on recommendations for fabrics and I think they get a little stuck, and there's a lot of different ways of looking at it or different approaches to picking fabric. So I'm going to talk about those today so that perhaps it'll open your mind as to your next project when you're picking fabric. So when you're paper piecing, essentially you're building a combination of shapes into one shape. You know, if for example you had a picture of a shoe and it was made up of 4 sections, you want those 4 sections, when they're put together, when you've pieced it, to read as one shape, a shoe. And the best way to do that is to use fabrics that may not be a solid, but they read as a solid. A solid is the most obvious first choice, and solids do work brilliantly with paper piecing. But you can also use tone-on-tones or different textures to create that solid color feel, which I'll talk about when I get into my fabrics. To start with though, here's an example of use of solids. This is actually using Cape Facet solids, and I use this for my heart tattoo pattern. But I didn't want it to be too dull, so I've used 3 different shades in the wing here to create an ombre effect. And this shot cotton is very soft. It's a little bit more frayish than say Kona or some of the other solids, but it's got a lovely soft feel. And I love the fact that there's an ever so slight subtle texture from the shot cottons, and then I contrasted that with the texture in the background. One way to get a solid color read is to use a texture, and this is one of my favorite textures to use. There are a few different fabrics in here. Alexander Henry has a line called Heath, which is I think this one here. Sketch is another one. Caroline Friedlander has also the same sort of scratchy feeling texture, which is beautiful. And this one here is Stuff. It's a pretty old fabric, but I quite like the texture on that. It also has that sort of interesting feel to it. However, it still reads as a very strong solid, and as you can see, you can get these in pretty much any color of the rainbow. Wood grains, these are by Joel Dewberry, and they also come in a wide range of colors. These are just 5 of the many they have. It reads as a solid, but it also gives you the ability to tell a little bit of a story. So if, say for example, you were piecing a box of apples, you could use this for the box, or a house, you could use it for the walls. And I've seen it used in a lot of paper piecing samples online, and I just love the feeling that it has. Now anyone that's seen any of my paper pieced work online will know that I'm a huge fan of cotton and steel, and these two are of my favorites. They're both part of their basics line. This is Sprinkle and comes in, as you can see, a wide array of colors. This particular one has a little neon pink dot on a natural cotton. I really love it, and used that in the background of my tattoo quilt, and I used a number of these also throughout the tattoo quilt. And then there is Exo, which I really love as well. My favorite, of course, is Lightning, which is this color here. This is a Rashida print, and the Sprinkle is a Sarah Watts. I'm quite sure I've bought bricks in both of their houses for the amounts of these basics that I've purchased. So these are some Alison Glass fabrics. I've never used Alison Glass until recently. I've just started a second badass quilt using her fabrics. And I love the intensity of the colors of them, and as you can see, they also read as a solid, even though the designs themselves are quite busy. I mean, that's a pretty busy design, but I think it's going to look beautiful when paper pieced on the letters. And sometimes the patterns can be a lot more detailed, like this one's quite busy, or this one's quite busy, but it still reads as a solid. These are all cotton and steel as well, in my favorite Lightning color. I've used those a lot in my tattoo quilt. And these guys have a little water droplets. That's the water droplet one I used on the lilies in my Grace pattern. But they still read as a solid, so quite nice for using in paper piecing, especially when the texture tells you a little bit of a story. Text fabrics were very in a few years ago, and are still somewhat in. I just love the way they have a texture which you're looking for, so it gives you that little point of interest, but sometimes you can also find words, like here you can see the word cutie that you could cut out on that one, or some of these in this great fabric here, but you can use them as a neutral, as a background, or even as a part of making up a shape as you do in paper piecing. And I love the feeling of text, and as a graphic designer I have a naturally drawn to letters, and they just have a great feel. Even this one you can see has a retro feel to it, so without saying retro it tells you it's retro. Some of them, like Caroline Friedlander's one here, has a bit more of an architectural feel to it, and this one here has a more vintage feel to it. So it's a texture and it's a neutral, and yet it has an additional story. So having told you that you need to use fabrics that read as a single color, I'm now going to contradict myself and explain to you how sometimes for certain sections in a paper piecing pattern you can just sneak a little image in there, which will add to your story. And these are some great ones. I love these little birds. I can't wait to find a spot to pop those in. Heather Ross has some beautiful prints that have little tiny images that you can quite easily sneak into a section. This is an Ayumi print that I love, that I've used on some paper piecing patterns as well. And these sneakers are definitely on my to-do list as well. So I'm going to show you examples now of how you can fussy cut some images into paper piecing blocks. When I saw this print by Happy Zombie, it's from a few years back now, it just reminded me of Soda Pop, and I definitely wanted to make some kind of a pop bottle pattern. And I found this great pattern by So Ichigo. I combined it with this really weird Japanese print that I'd had for ages, and popped those on the labels and made this little zippy pouch for my daughter. And I love the feeling of how you can look at that and you just get a sense of the fizzy pop. These are an example. I made a block for our guild for paper piecing some spools, and I used some fabrics that emulated the thread or just sewing imagery to make these blocks. This one here is one of Amy Friend's blocks. It comes from her TP quilt, and I love the block. So I picked fabrics that, obviously, the clouds for the sky. This one had a more traditional TP type print. I threw the deer in there and the prairie grass feel, and I made this block to remind myself of when we stayed in a TP with our kids one year at Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump in Alberta, and it really has the feeling of the big Alberta sky and the prairie grass and of course the deer. Here's another example of their vintage alphabet pattern. This is just simply fussy cutting some stripes into place to make the different sections you can see here join nicely so that the letter is all pieced as one stripy piece. For this block, because it's so teeny tiny, I actually used Liberty fabric. The Liberty has tiny print, which works really nicely with the tiny imagery. In addition to that, it's a very lightweight voile fabric, and so it doesn't make too much bulk in there, but you can see there's some really tiny piecing in there, and I quite like these little water lilies. It's part of my water lily pattern that was an outtake from the Grace pattern. On this love pillow, I used my love heart tattoo pattern, and I picked this cotton and steel fabric over here with these little semicircles because it emulated the feathers and wings for me. On the banner I used also cotton and steel. It's a text fabric, and I fussy cut the words love and cutie, which is down here, which just double down on the love message. On the respect tattoo pattern, I wanted to create the illusion of the dappled forest light on the deer's face, so I used a couple of fabrics for that. This one is a cotton and steel one. It has these little tiny squares that's a tone on tone, and for the little nose section I used this new Libs Elliot fabric. I don't know if you can see, but it's silvery, and so it has that reflection sort of feel to it, also with little squares, and I used that on that nose section, as you can see here on the pattern. In the ears, I actually stuck a very subtle texture. It's a white fabric, but these tiny little lightning bolts. It's also part of Libs Elliott's new fabric, but I liked the fact that the little lightning bolts symbolized sort of inner power to me. On this hope tattoo pattern, the swallows symbolized hope to sailors, because when they saw the swallows they knew they were close to land. And so I wanted to have that feeling of being out at sea on this one, and I used Rashida's fabric of this driving rain for the backs of the swallows to symbolize that harshness that the hope overcomes. So I really love how that fabric worked on this particular pattern. For Grace, on the swan itself, I used a cotton and steel with floral. Now this is a sort of unusual fabric to use in paper piecing because it's got quite a bold print, but I positioned the flowers so that they were out of the way of the swan's face, and I love the gentleness and grace that swans represent. And if you look at the water lilies, you'll see this Lessian fabric that I used of little water droplets that had that feeling of the lilies on the water, and I just loved how they just fitted right nicely into those little petals of the lilies. In contrast to the gentleness of the Grace pattern, this Fury tattoo pattern, I used a wood grain print, and I wanted that to represent a hardened heart, because that's how you feel when you're furious. And I also used a lot more intense colors than I used on some of the more gentle patterns like the Respect and the Grace, as you can see here. For the Peace Cranes pattern, each peace crane requires 3 different shades, a light, a medium and a dark, of the same color. I wanted to use fabrics that looked somewhat like Japanese origami paper. As you can see, small floral prints, and also this one green is a Libs Elliot fabric that has these sort of folded looking shapes, and I liked how that fitted in on the green crane. For the Wisdom tattoo pattern, the eyeball, or the iris of the eye, I used this great Libs fabric. I don't know if you can see on the camera, there's a little bit of iridescent shimmer. And I also liked how those hexy shapes, for me, emulated how an iris looks. So it was just the perfect pick for that. And then for the triangular shapes around the eyeball, the left and right ones have arrows going left and right. And for me, that symbolized how the meaning behind this wisdom block was all about having a broader view on life and trusting your intuition. When I did my first version of my Courage tattoo pattern, I wanted to emulate that sense of battle, because sometimes when we are facing adversity, that's when we have to summon our courage. So I did that a few ways. The breastplate itself here, I used 2 different greys with a texture on them to have that feeling of it being metal, as they used in the old medieval times. The banner I did out of a wood grain print, and the combination of that breastplate and that wooden banner to me felt a little bit like a crest. And then the background fabric, you can see, I think it's a Deer Stella fabric. It has these little arrows, as in bows and arrows, which just tied in with the whole concept nicely. On the second version I did of the Courage pattern, you'll see here I used a cotton and steel with these sparkles. So I had to do a more colorful version because this second version is part of my big official tattoo quilt, so I needed to have the same background fabric as the others, as well as some brighter colors, but I still wanted to have that feeling of a traditional metal breastplate, which is why I used these 2 prints here. Even though they're green, the sparkle on this one side has a feeling of that sort of angular metal feel to it. Anyway, that's my 2 bits on picking fabrics for paper piecing patterns. There's so many fabrics out there. Have fun picking yours for your projects. I really hope this was helpful to you.